was really an attempt to reinvigorate the Silk Road that used to stretch across Central Asia all the way through Russia, Ukraine, and then into Europe and partially down into Turkey and the Middle East. If Ukraine remains unstable, in other words, if it remains a hotbed of controversy, a source of continual conflict with Russia, then that One Belt, One Road project collapses because they have to run the rail lines across Central Asia through Ukraine into Europe. Now, if you're Greek or a Slovak or Hungarian, you look at this and say, this is marvelous, because these rail lines are going to help improve our position economically. Our prosperity will rise. We'll be able to do business with China without shipping things all the way around Africa or through the Arctic into China. But if you are an American and you view anything that China does as somehow or another dangerous to American national interest, then you, ostensibly the Biden administration, want to keep the war in Ukraine going as long as possible in order to sabotage trade and commerce between Europe and China.
President Xi has let it be known that he's considering visiting Moscow. I mean, how dramatic would that be? And what do you think he'd be saying to Vladimir Putin if they meet together in their private moments?
Well, I think he will go to Moscow next week. I'd be surprised if he didn't. And he's going to show up with his peace proposal. And I think his peace proposal is a fairly straightforward one. First of all, no preconditions. We're going to stop shooting. We'll regard the current lines as permanent for the moment, at least temporarily permanent, if you will. And we're going to talk and see what we come up with as a solution to the war. I think Putin will be responsive in a positive way to that. Frankly, I think the president of Poland has already said that's something that he would support. I know that Orban in Hungary will support it. And I think Zelensky, whose back is increasingly against the wall, will view this as potentially useful. Now, we have said already we oppose any intervention by the Chinese. I think it's very stupid because, as I've said before, they have a very keen interest in what happens in Ukraine. They simply want the fighting to stop.
I'm surprised at what you said, and of course I heard it before, but when you say it, it's so credible about the president of Poland. I mean, 3 months ago he was calling for an invasion of Crimea. Now he's saying ceasefire at the lines where they are.
Well, effectively he's saying, let's listen to what the Chinese have to say. It would be foolish not to. He knows that ultimately Poland, when the war is over, will want to do business with China as well. You know, this is the thing that no one thinks about when you go to war. What do you want things to look like when the war ends?
Right.
You don't start a war and then hope that it's open-ended and perpetual.
Has President Putin, as far as you can tell from observing him and listening to him, given thought to what he wants and where he will be when the war ends?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from the very beginning, he said he wanted a neutral Ukraine. He wanted equal rights before the law for all the citizens of Ukraine, including the Russians that constituted almost a third of the population. He made it very clear that he wanted the legitimacy of Russian control over Crimea recognized. Those were effectively his demands, if you want to put them that way, or conditions. I think those conditions continue. The problem now is that a lot of blood has been spilled. And the Russians are not going to surrender territory where, frankly, the population is Russian to begin with, and turn it back over to the Ukrainians. In fact, in Bakhmut, which has gotten so much attention now, the Ukrainians complain periodically that their positions are given away by the local population, which is Russian, to the Russians. Good God, I mean, the Russians aren't going to surrender Bakhmut. Let's be frank, if we are involved in striking targets in Crimea, if we are directly involved, that's an act of war against the Russian state and the Russian people. She knows that, and she should exercise better judgment. She also knows that the position in Ukraine is hopeless. She's trying to do the thing that we have worried about most of all, drag us into the war.
What is her end game? Does she really, well, I guess we know her end game from her prior behavior. She fomented and orchestrated the coup of 2014. She was largely responsible for the testimony from the Ukraine side given against President Trump in the impeachment, in the first of his impeachment. What does she want to do now? Does she really think that she can preside over driving Vladimir Putin out of office?
My impression is that people inside the Beltway have a very unrealistic view of Russia and of the Russian state and its leader. And they actually believe much of what they say, which is extremely dangerous. I call it ideological blindness. They are filled with so much hatred for Russia and the government They're incapable of seeing reality. They don't understand that what they want to do will not happen.
Colonel, are we able, is the American private enterprise, the military-industrial complex, if you will, able to manufacture ammunition as fast as the Ukrainians are using it?
No, obviously not. And in fact, the Washington Post had an article about the artillery problem, the artillery ammunition problem, saying that there was no way we could do it. In fact, we would need many, many, many months, perhaps years even, to reconstitute the arsenal that we've turned over to Ukraine in terms of Javelin missiles and the various AMRAAM missiles that operate for NASAMS and other weapon systems. The 155 millimeter artillery ammunition is now very, very scarce. The Europeans have practically no industrial base. The only one that can really produce very much quickly is Germany. And they're now in a position that is so weak, their defense minister says Germany is incapable of defending itself, therefore can't afford to send anything else overseas.
The Secretary of Defense is a retired four-star career military. I don't know if he's West Point or not, you would know, but
Yes.
Okay, career military. He's presiding over the depletion of American defensive, and if we need it, offensive weaponry, which will take years to replace. Is that what you're telling us?
Well, Judge, he was not appointed to the job that he currently holds as Secretary of Defense because they expected him to present resistance to dumb ideas.
Nice,
We have to keep that in mind.
in your usual diplomatic way. But this is catastrophic. It's malfeasance in office.
Well, if you're worried about the defense of the United States, I'd say you're absolutely right, particularly in the category of missiles. In terms of 155 ammunition, I don't see any armies landing in the Western Hemisphere and marching on the United States. But as far as fighting a war overseas, which people have talked about for years, it's a non-starter. We don't have enough ammunition to last us 2 weeks. I'd be surprised if we had a month's worth of ammunition sitting on the ground in Poland.
Does the President of the United States, well, I know you can't answer this because you can't get in his brain. You know what he meant. Do the people around him understand this when he says things like, we're going to defend Taiwan at all costs? I mean, that would be, in my view, I'm not a military guy, as you know, you correct me if I'm wrong, a military impossibility.
Sure, well, it's another place 6,000 miles away from the United States. I mean, that's the problem with Ukraine. If you're going to fight a major adversary, a continental power like Russia or China or something, the last thing you want to do is make it easy for them and fight them on their doorstep. That is strategically stupid. That's the problem with this entire business in Ukraine. That's the problem with pushing NATO's borders out to the east. It's impossible to defend. In fact, Eisenhower felt it was impossible to defend NATO long before it had East European states as neighbors. He simply said, we don't have the resources on hand or the manpower.
Why did
I
NATO,
don't think a lot has changed since Eisenhower left.
why did NATO stay in existence after the Warsaw Pact dissolved and Eastern Europe was liberated? Because Gorbachev believed what Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush told him. What was the reason for NATO after that?
Well, there were two things. On the one hand, from the European vantage point, they saw NATO, and I'm talking now about the West Europeans, because at that point there were no members from the East, as you point out. They viewed NATO as an insurance policy against another war in Europe. It was unambiguously defensive, and it was designed to ensure that no new wars broke out on the continent. We saw it in a very different light. We saw it increasingly as something that we could leverage in the pursuit of our foreign policy aims.